The only American professor of ecclesiastical history active during the lifetime of Joseph Smith was Samuel Miller, here pictured, who taught the subject at Princeton Seminary from 1813 to 1849. Miller was actually professor of ecclesiastical history and church government, and although he claimed to keep the two subjects of his professorship separate, his teachings of church history strongly focused on polity. In other words, his primary aim was to show that the Presbyterian form of church government was in place at Christianity's inception. Miller then, like Joseph Smith, believed in the same organization that existed in the primitive church. The difference between the two was that Miller turned to the patristic sources to defend this particular form of church government, while Joseph Smith never did. Miller was certainly not enamored of patristics in general. Nevertheless, he thought that budding Presbyterian ministers should know the opinion and practice of our fathers in all past ages. Mostly, however, such knowledge was intended to serve apologetic rather than pastoral purposes, since in the 19th century the fathers were deployed by Protestant professors to batter down claims regarding doctrine and polity made by competing Christian groups, to help claim their denomination's governance as faithful to that of the apostolic era, and to prove how soon in Christian history a decline had set in that led precipitously towards Roman Catholicism. Only the last of these approaches applies to early Mormon discourse, as far as I've been able to tell. Moreover, with the exception of the doctrine of baptism for the dead, early Latter-day Saint authors were not quick to enlist the fathers as allies or opponents in contemporary denominational battles over religious belief and practice in the culture wars of the day. The culture wars of the day were, however, primarily fought over rights of association with the primitive church. As such, the battleground lay in the correct interpretation of the Bible, with the preferred weapons of being theological science, as Robert Baird tells us in his 1844 survey of religion in the United States of America. Baird observes that the increased attention which the theologians of America are giving to the accurate and learned investigation of the Holy Scriptures may be regarded as an indication of the tendency of theological science in this country. Such a view was founded on the premise, quote, that the Scriptures are the only authority in matters of faith, a premise that Baird states was not only universally acknowledged in theory, but more and more practically acted upon. This quest for right interpretation was considered to be both science and art. The best theologian, states Baird, must be he who understands best and can best explain the Bible. Moreover, this interpretation was detached from the historical development of Christian doctrine. The question, what did Edwards hold? What did the Reformers hold? What did Augustine, Jerome, or the earliest fathers hold, though admitted to be important in their place, says Baird, are regarded as of small importance in comparison with the question, what saith the Scriptures? What did Christ and the apostles teach? Miller and Joseph Smith thus worked within a theological context in which the tendency of theological science, as well as a popular exposition of Christianity from the pulpit, was towards the primitive simplicity of Christian truth. Such a view necessarily prejudices against the fathers. As Elizabeth Clark points out in her study of the development of the field of early church history, upon which this portion of my paper is based, in Protestant America, appropriating the church fathers was always a negotiation with what interpreters believed were the authentic words of Jesus, who could be cordoned off from subsequent Christian history. How then were the fathers appropriated in the early 19th century? The easiest answer is with difficulty. Elizabeth Clark, for example, in commenting on the academic infrastructure that attended the teaching of church history in early and mid-19th century America, observed that suitable textbooks seemed non-existent, let alone anthologies of primary sources in translation, and libraries were conceived as book depositories for shockingly small collections and were only open for a few hours a week. From the composition of Miller's personal library, it is not unreasonable to conclude that many of the patristic writings that Miller cited in his polemics against Episcopalians and others were derived not from first-hand knowledge of the primary sources, but from secondary accounts. There is a certain irony in this fact, since when, for example, Samuel Miller wished to impress upon his students the decline that soon affected the church, he exhorted them, read Cyprian, read Origen, read Eusebius. But there is no suggestion that these authors were required reading for the class, nor for that matter that the students had access to these texts. In fact, it was not until the publication of the American edition of the Ante-Nicene Fathers in 1885, beginning 1885, and the Nicene and Post-Nicene Fathers beginning in 1886, a project initiated by Philip Schaff, really the father of patristic study in 19th century America, that students had ready access to the Fathers in translation at all. Even then, the focus was on the earliest period of patristic writing, that period most likely to aid a correct interpretation of the New Testament. The profile of early Mormon encounters with the Fathers fits within the contemporary trends. So, for example, it is not at all surprising that there is no evidence in early Mormon periodicals, that the contributors had read any single patristic text in its entirety. Rather, all quotations from patristic sources or references to events and figures of the early church are taken from general church histories or encyclopedia articles. Moreover, even the articles reprinted from the newspapers and books of the day are themselves derived from general works rather than from the reading of patristic texts. We can draw two conclusions from a general survey of patristic citations in early Mormon periodicals, and there aren't a great number of them. Firstly, Latter-day Saints of this period were reading several different general histories of Christianity and using what was relevant in their own publications. Secondly, readers of early Mormon periodicals were introduced or referred to many key figures and ideas from early Christianity in these periodicals, suggesting either a certain level of general literacy regarding early Christianity or that patristic authors and early church events were evoked more for their cultural or apologetic potency than for any inherent value that they were deemed to have by the authors who mentioned them. I'm now going to look at three specific examples, three themes that we find coming out of the use of patristic and early church materials in early Mormon periodicals. In turning from general considerations to specific examples, we will look at three themes treated in early Mormon periodicals that resort to the early church fathers in interesting ways. Two of the earliest articles that mention the fathers are on the theme of persecution. The articles appear in the June 1832 issue of the Evening and Morning Star and the August 1835 issue of the Messenger and Advocate, and both are extracted from other sources. Importantly, however, both are framed by deliberate prefatory remarks that provide the hermeneutical lens through which the pieces should be read. We could even go so far as to say that the reproduced articles serve as the rhetorical flagpole upon which the introductory comments are raised. The theological setting of the June 1832 article is charged with a certain apocalyptic fervour, which can not only be seen by the publication of Doctrine and Covenants 45, 1-17 in this issue, and 3 Nephi 30 earlier in the same issue, but also from other editorial remarks, such as that which prefaced news regarding a cholera epidemic then raging in the Middle East, which reads, "It is with no ordinary feeling that we select an item or two in relation to the cholera morbus. Its ravages for the past year on the eastern continent have been great, so that if ever the pestilence walked in darkness, or destruction wasted at noonday, now is the time. But the Lord has declared that it should be so before he comes in glory, and we have only to rely upon him for deliverance when he sweeps the earth with the besom of destruction." The editor is W. Phelps, as we may have guessed from the wonderful language, and the same sort of heightened rhetoric introduces a subsequent article on persecution in the early Christian church. This article is reprinted from a contemporary newspaper, but ultimately derives from James Wheatley's 1751 volume entitled The Lives, Trials and Sufferings of the Holy Apostles, Primitive Fathers and Martyrs, who have from time to time suffered for the faith and the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ, and within that text, lines have been interpolated from Fox's Book of the Martyrs. In the course of recounting the sufferings and martyrdoms endured by the early Christians under the reign of Nero, the author refers specifically to Eusebius as a source for the narrative and to a quotation by Tertullian regarding the persecution. The point is not to evoke empathy for the early Christian saints so much as a sense of kinship. As Phelps remarks, the following article has lately appeared in the newspapers of the day, and we copy it to show that the religion of Jesus Christ has always been persecuted. But when a saint lives to God, persecution or applause is all one. The soul is above them. 3 years later, Oliver Cowdery, in his role as editor of The Messenger and Advocate, published another article on the theme of persecution, which reproduces the entire chapter 6 of Fox's History of the Martyrs. We know that copies of Fox's Book of the Martyrs have been circulating among the saints at least from 1834, and that one such copy came into the hands of Joseph Smith. Oliver Cowdery did not engage with the text in the tradition of learned ministry, as did John Wesley, for example, who produced an abridgment of the Acts and Monuments. Rather, Oliver was concerned to emphasize the inevitability, again, of persecution following the saints. Few men in our day, Cowdery observes, know of the extreme persecution the ancient saints endured for the sake of the gospel of Jesus Christ. This statement would be less true if Cowdery were talking about the saints of the New Testament church. As his readers would well know, Paul, who, as Cowdery goes on to say, Paul, who also suffered death for the testimony which he bore, has given us to understand that those who live godly in Christ Jesus suffer persecution. And the author of the Epistle to the Hebrews has mentioned the fact that those who lived before him were under the necessity of excluding themselves from society and wander in dens and caves of the earth. However, Cowdery reproduces a chapter from Fox that describes 4th century and not 1st century persecutions. Cowdery thus, perhaps inadvertently, sets up a tension between a belief in the decline, the rapid decline of earliest Christianity, and a recognition motivated by this experience of martyrdom of the sincerity of the faith of the persecuted Christians of later centuries. However, the choice of the Galerian persecutions, 303 to 311, may have been further validated by a belief that the authenticity and priesthood authority of early Christianity had been retained at least until the Council of Nicaea. Perhaps this could, as I think can be understood from a statement made in an article published a year earlier in the Evening and Morning Star. The purpose of including this extract, however, was not to make a theological point, nor simply to inform the saints about the faithful who were persecuted in the early 4th century, but rather to give Cowdery's readers an idea of the unanimity of the enemies of the truth and the eagerness to deprive the saints of their privileges and rights. The tendency to generate sympathy for and recognize the faith of the early church was vastly outweighed by a desire to demonstrate the decline, deviation, degradation, or apostasy of early Christianity. This was a common motif among Protestant and especially Restorationist movements. However, the theme of the declension and apostasy of the early church took on a personal aspect for the Latter-day Saints in the Kirtland crisis of 1837. Certainly, Warren Cowdery aimed to make this point in the July 1837 issue of The Messenger and Advocate by reprinting a long extract from Joseph Milner's Church History, which recounts episodes from the first Christian century. He was concerned in this section to show the propensity, this is his words, the propensity of mankind to deviate from the course which the God of heaven has pointed out for his servants to pursue, thus reiterating the traditional narrative of decline. However, the extract was intended to have a more specific and immediate message, which was to demonstrate that, quote, even in the 1st century, while those eminent men were yet living who received their instructions from the great head of the church and held communion with the unseen world through the medium of that spirit which was promised them to lead them into truth, the great proneness in mankind to apostatize or substitute something for religion or something of its ordinances which the God of heaven never accepted. The text is a warning, repeating the warning of Paul that grievous wolves shall enter in among you, not sparing the flock. Cowdery concludes the introduction by simply affirming that the history of the church subsequent to that period fully verifies that prediction. We therefore recommend the candid perusal of this extract and hope our readers may profit by the instruction contained in it. In this extract, then, readers are invited to encounter a polyvalent text, seeing evidence of both ancient decline and its possible repetition during the Restoration due to the great proneness of man to apostatize, even when living among those eminent men who received their instruction from the great head of the church. Belief in vicarious baptism, Guy Bishop notes, was not a part of mid-19th century American religions. This may be true in practice, However, the subject, at least as raised by 1 Corinthians 15:29, was a controversial issue in the exegetical literature of the day. Thus, the early 19th century English New Testament scholar Samuel Thomas Bloomfield wrote, quote, "If we were to judge," and you can see this partly on the screen, "if we were to judge the difficulty of this passage from the variety of interpretations, we should say that it is the most obscure passage in the New Testament. The learning and labour expended on ascertaining the sense has been immense, and the matter contained in the various dissertations would form a good-sized volume." Bloomfield himself rejected the attempts to construe the passage figuratively or metaphorically as other commentators had, since such interpretations were deemed to be simply philologically insupportable, and instead he concluded that, quote, "there can be no doubt that the expression is to be taken in the natural sense." And it seems that he initially was convinced by the interpretation of the ancient fathers, Tertullian, Epiphanius, and Ambrose, who he cites, as well as many eminent modern expositors who consider that the verse is in fact making a matter-of-fact allusion to the practice of vicarious baptism, i.e., of baptizing a living person in the place of and for the benefit of one who has died unbaptized. However, before Bloomfield can settle into this exegetical solution, he is caught in his own tracks by concerns that, quote, "no certain proof has been adduced that the practice of vicarious baptism was prevalent so early as the time when the passage was written." They knew it happened later in the early church. And at last, Bloomfield's own prejudices decide the day. Quote, "nor is it to be believed that the apostle would, for the sake of so precarious an argument, for the practice was doubtless very rare and secret, countenance so grovelling a superstition involving a profanation of baptism." Thus, for Bloomfield, the argument turns on the simple implausibility of vicarious baptism being an authentic early Christian practice, with the concomitant implausibility of Paul referencing an errant practice simply in order to make a point about the resurrection. Bloomfield's analysis, his Greek Testament from which this comes, was first published in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia in 1837, provides part of the intellectual and exegetical context within which we should place Joseph Smith's early remarks about baptism for the dead, such as the statement in his letter to the Travelling High Council dated 19th of June 1840, that baptism for the dead was, quote, "certainly practiced by the ancient churches." Here, Joseph's new doctrine is positioned as the only correct exegesis of Paul's problematic saying about an early Christian practice. Thus, even though Joseph Smith says that he gained his knowledge, quote, "independent of the Bible," the religious potency of the doctrine of baptism for the dead is magnified by Joseph's insistence that he has reached, without the aid of theological science, the correct interpretation of Scripture. Thus, although the fathers, and indeed Paul, are in no way presented as being catalytic in the development of this doctrine, they are readily mustered as confirming witnesses to Joseph Smith's restoration doctrines. It was almost 2 years after the doctrine of baptism for the dead was first preached and began to be practiced that a Mormon publication included a confirming quotation from the fathers. When they did, the quotation was used to confirm two things simultaneously. First, that baptism for the dead was known to be practiced in the early church. And secondly, that this practice had inevitably devolved into a degenerate state. This is the passage. Chrysostom says that the Marcionites practiced baptism for the dead. This is what it says as it goes on. After a catechumen, this is what Chrysostom says, after a catechumen was dead, they had a living man under the bed of the deceased. Then, coming to the dead man, they asked him whether he would receive baptism. And he, making no answer, the other answered for him, and said that he would be baptized in his stead. And so they baptized the living for the dead. It's The passage first appeared in an editorial on the doctrine of the baptism for the dead, published in the Times and Seasons for April the 15th, 1842. The editorial is simply signed the editor, and since Joseph Smith is listed as the editor for this issue, it's not unreasonable to assume that he's the author of this piece. However, it seems that both John Taylor and Wilford Woodruff were involved in the Times and Seasons at this period, so it's reasonable to conclude that this editorial on baptism for the dead was at least a joint production by John Taylor and Joseph Smith. The Chrysostom quotation is drawn from an article on baptism for the dead in Buck's well-known theological dictionary, which was published in Philadelphia in 1830, and which is now known to have been the source for the first paragraph of the Lectures on Faith, and therefore in active use among Latter-day Saints from at least 1835. Interestingly, Benjamin Winchester, another Latter-day Saint writer of sort of dubious standing, is also reading Buck and giving this same quotation in his Synopsis of the Holy Scriptures, also published in 1842. This gives us an extremely interesting opportunity to observe the subtle but significant differences in the handling of this quotation in these two different publications and by these two different editors. Buck warns the reader in his dictionary that vicarious baptism was, quote, practiced among the Marcionites with a great deal of ridiculous ceremony. Of course, such remarks participate in a generally held belief that the extravagant rituals of Catholicism are a sure sign of the decline from the simplicity of primitive Christianity. Nonetheless, Winchester includes this phrase when he cites this passage, and he also extends his quotation from Buck to include some of the reservations expressed by Buck about the dating of the practice of vicarious baptism for the dead back to Paul, even citing a commentator who interprets the verse quite differently. What is more, whereas the Times and Seasons editorial simply appropriates this quotation without attribution, Winchester cites his sources. Winchester's caution is thrown to the wind by the more confident author of the editorial for the Times and Seasons. The allusion to this being a ridiculous ceremony is removed. More importantly, the quotation from the Times and Seasons is framed by a statement that guides the reader to immediately apprehend its significance. Quote, the church, of course, at this time was degenerate, and the particular form might be incorrect. But the thing is sufficiently plain in the Scriptures. Hence, Paul, in speaking of the doctrine, says, and goes on to quote this verse, thus, no doubt is raised about the straight line that can be drawn even through the mists of degeneration between Paul's statement and the passage from Chrysostom. In other words, these are linked together strongly as evidence of Joseph Smith's restoration practice. Conclusions. Joseph Smith's relationship to the ancient world is charged by the claim that Mormonism is not a new religion. B.H. Roberts is emphatic about this point. Mormonism, I repeat, is not a new religion. It's the old religion, the everlasting gospel restored again to the earth through the revelations received by Joseph Smith. Of course, Mormonism was not the only Christian sect to claim continuity with the primitive church. However, although the usage of patristic citations for apologetic purposes fits within the broad contemporary trends, there's no evidence that the fathers were ever turned to as a source for new knowledge. Unlike their contemporaries, quote, as a critical component of their restoration project, Joseph Smith and his followers were not content to rely on the Bible alone, close quote. The key to Mormonism's vitality, therefore, was Joseph's willingness and ability to generate new knowledge independent of the Bible. Thus, if we were to rightly interpret the evidence of context between Joseph Smith and his followers and the early fathers, we must acknowledge that the contexts were principally driven by an impulse to identify validating material among the ancient religious texts and cultural remains that they came in contact with. There is no holy eclecticism here. The Christian fathers were not put in service in the quest for truth, rather they are seen as barely plausible witnesses to a truth that has seeped away from the once pristine primitive church. Therefore, the fathers were relevant to the restoration project only as reluctant witnesses, not as conduits of lost truth. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the presenters for their thoughtful and informative papers. Rather than spending too much time on the particular strengths and weaknesses of these presentations, their arguments, I think, are mostly clear and compelling. I'd like to pay the highest compliment by commenting on the thoughts, ideas, and issues they invoke. This conference in general, and this panel in particular, ask, whether explicitly or implicitly, questions of intellectual validity, vindication, or dependence. Did Joseph Smith restore ideas present in the ancient world, yet absent in his contemporary culture? This panel, was he dependent on other texts for his own ideas, revelations, and scriptures? This panel is specifically interested in Joseph Smith's relationship to the ancient sources, the Apocrypha, Josephus, and the patristics. Do these sources vindicate or condemn the prophet? As Thomas Wayman's paper aptly says, quote, for LDS scholars, the presence of parallels to ancient texts and early Mormon writings has been indicative that Joseph Smith restored ancient doctrines and practices, while for critics, on the other hand, quote, the presence and parallels has often been used to draw attention to the possibility that Joseph plagiarized available sources. Tellingly, the papers in this panel largely sidestep such a dualistic and simplistic framework. While they touch on issues of dependency, awareness, and vitality, they uncover another layer of inquiry by exploring the type of work Joseph Smith performed with these sources. Jared Ludlow, for instance, demonstrates how early church writings show an interest in apocryphal texts and an affinity to the eschatological prophecies found therein with the saints' current situation. Besides Smith's famous encounter with those texts while translating the Bible, a revelatory intersection that resulted in D&C 91, Ludlow shows that early Mormons were oft to quote from, reference, and vindicate their own ideas through these books found on the periphery of the scriptural canon. Whether it was using Jasher in church periodicals, or Joseph Smith insisting that the Apocrypha be included in the Nauvoo Temple's cornerstone, or a splinter group basing their authority on an exegesis of the Book of Esdras, saints were not only aware of but also engaged with these hybrid texts. As we move away from an emphasis on the quantitative intersections of ideas, who knew what and when, toward a qualitative analysis of these intersections, what does it tell us about Mormonism's culture? Two important points and questions can be drawn from Ludlow's excellent analysis. First, it leads us to ask the question of whether Mormons were more common to draw from the Apocrypha than other American churches. Was there something in Mormonism's open canon that made them unusually receptive to ideas of extra-canonical books? This issue seems to point to a broader dynamic in Mormon history. On the one hand, saints seem eager to find new revelatory texts. Indeed, their church's prophetic claims seem to mandate such. But on the other hand, Joseph Smith and church leaders were left to find some type of canonical restraint that curtailed scriptural power and maintained a coherent revelatory corpus. The threats of the schismatic group posed by drawing on the authority of the Book of Esdras is an example. And as David Holland has demonstrated in his book Sacred Borders, this was a larger cultural dynamic at play in American culture in general, thus making Mormonism an important case study in establishing theological and scriptural boundaries while still maintaining some form of cultural elasticity. Second, Ludlow's paper skillfully shows the Mormons' imaginative reading of apocryphal sources, setting a blueprint for mapping Mormon interpretive readings in general. Yes, Mormons read the Apocrypha, but they read it in distinct ways. In most cases, it was read to validate their unique Mormon views and vindicate their millenarian expectations. Phil Barlow labeled this process selective literalism, and Grant Underwood has shown that the larger millenarian framework saturated their hermeneutic world. This case study seems to validate these claims and can expand the analysis to better encompass the cultural work Mormon extra-canonical scripture reading entailed. Professor Wayman similarly addressed the Apocrypha, though from a subtly different angle. His approach emphasized the method behind the content and makes sophisticated observations while doing so. The previous dichotomous analysis of Joseph Smith as restorer of lost texts, or Joseph Smith as willful plagiarizer, is inadequate, he tells us, because it overlooks the simple fact that Joseph Smith's biblical culture engendered a language and memory that promoted both overlap as well as distinction. I appreciate Women's characterization of Joseph Smith as a cultural Bible reader who incorporated, either consciously or subconsciously, elements and phrases from the corpus of writings we know as the Apocrypha. From the names Nephi and Isaiah in the Book of Mormon to the description of St. Paul in Nauvoo, Smith drew from the cultural verbiage bequeathed from the books he read and the orality he heard. Such a porous relationship imbibed rhetorical and ideological crossover to a degree that evades simplistic categories. Though he doesn't use a term, Wayman is utilizing the powerful tools of a theoretical model known as communities of discourse. Practitioners of this term pay special attention to how a shared culture and shared discourse shape rhetorical space and that adds specific meaning to particular words and phrases. This places the knowledge of cultural context at a premium, for it requires a historian to make sense of seemingly similar ideas. It also introduces a sophisticated theoretical framework that transcends the simplistic and bifurcated categories that have dominated Mormon intellectual history. This now brings up the tricky question of intellectual influence, a recurring theme in several of these panels. In my estimation, to claim either ideological dependence or independence in the classic sense, where Joseph Smith is either depicted as completely indebted to or free from these other sources, is based on at least three critical mistaken assumptions, all of which are rooted in a distinctly positivist outlook. First is the idea of a cogent intellectual source from which to copy ideas in the first place. This assumes that there was a comprehensive, cohesive corpus of ideas passed down from the early church fathers or Josephus from the past, or Thomas Dick and Emanuel Swedenborg in the present. As the papers in this panel have shown, which is supported by other scholarship in the last few decades, these ancient and modern ideas were as multifaceted as they were dynamic. To assume cohesion would be to endow an artificial systemization that is clearly not there. The second mistaken assumption is the concept of intellectual transmission, or the idea that these theologies and ideas can be passed on within a vacuum. As these papers especially demonstrate, though, concepts and ideas, even when originating from a single individual, become porous across an energetic print and religious culture. American religionists don't know Josephus's writings as much as they know Richard Watson's interpretations of Josephus's writings as found in his theological dictionary. There was no such thing as an objective and honest reading of an ancient or contemporary source, only interpretive and imaginative misreadings that reveal more about the reader than they do of the original author. Such analysis fruitfully draws from the rich field of reader response theory and captures the topic's complexity. The third caution in tracing an intellectual and reception history is to note that the resulting theology produced by those who are under question of being influenced are often as eclectic and dynamic as the original ideas and the transmission process. This is especially true of Joseph Smith, who is much more eclectic than syncretistic in his prophetic endeavors and didn't seem too concerned with the niceties of a systematic theology. Thus, the basic assumption of intellectual history, at least as seen in past generations of Mormon historiography, that implies a cohesive primary source, cohesive transmission, and cohesive theological result, overlooks the messiness of religious history in general and early Mormon thought in particular. Which leads us to Lincoln Blumel's paper, which asks a series of provocative questions surrounding what has Josephus to do with Joseph. The first question, was Josephus's work popular in early America, is answered with a resounding yes, though with qualification. The translations and editions of Josephus's works were sporadic, incomplete, and uneven, and most Americans were exposed to Josephus through secondary sources. The second question, were Mormons aware of Josephus, is similarly nuanced. Yes, Josephus keeps popping up in LDS print history, but any more than superficial examination will reveal that they too were primarily dependent on what others said of Josephus rather than what Josephus said himself. The third question, and a question that previous generations sometimes obsess over, is was Joseph Smith dependent on Josephus? The answer, which I imagine we could all anticipate, is no, though there are some noteworthy similarities. Blumel demonstrates persuasively, in my opinion, that to claim intellectual plagiarism is the case in the case of Joseph and Josephus would be a grossly simplistic and misdirected reading of two very complex and dynamic thinkers. And I mourn that you weren't able to see his extended analysis of their writings, which was really top-notch. But importantly, Blumel doesn't stop there. Breaking down the artificial and superficial barriers of intellectual dependence and independence is merely the first step of responsible analysis. The fourth question of Blumel's paper is more subtle and implied than the others, but is perhaps the most important. Beyond determining influence, are there still lessons to be learned in comparing Josephus and Joseph Smith? I think the answer is clearly yes, as the paper demonstrates the power of a comparative study, even of two figures separated by nearly 2 millennia. Both thinkers, Blumel writes in his conclusion, which he scrapped in this paper, so luckily I have it for you, have in common the idea that the biblical text is malleable and can be expanded, contracted, or even reshaped. Though their motives for doing so were undoubtedly quite different, the mere fact that both felt the biblical text was seemingly inadequate and that they possessed authority, even audacity, to alter the text represents an important parallel. End quote. This point hits on one of the hallmarks of religious studies as a discipline, that analysis is always done best when done in comparison. Call it the Darwinian metaphor. Only in competition can uniqueness be determined or developed. And this leads us finally to Kristian Heal's examination of patristic writings in early Mormon periodicals. Here we find a prime example of using Mormonism as a singular case study amongst a broader issue. Joseph Smith is placed alongside Samuel Miller, Robert Baird, and Samuel Bloomfield as examples of those who balance a primitivist worldview which maintained a declension narrative of early Christianity with a paradoxical obsession with early Christian writers. As Heal astutely notes, a yearning for primitive simplicity prejudiced Americans against the Christian followers, yet reference to the fathers remained plentiful. The three theological uses that the patristics served, persecution, apostasy, and rights for the dead, held a tenuous position within the Mormon and Christian corpus and bequeathed an ironic legacy of pragmatic adaptation and creative reinterpretation. Though I disagree with Heal's conclusion that the Church Fathers were not put in service in the quest for truth, based on my interpretation of Joseph Smith's eclectic and restorative prophetic approach, I agree with his general idea that Mormons used patristics quite selectively and unevenly. The analysis found in this panel, the sophisticated interpretations of Joseph Smith's creative readings of ancient texts, can be further expanded by utilizing the tools of the cultural turn in today's academy. Intellectual historian David Hall recently argued that the future of intellectual history depends on our ability to be hybrid creatures and incorporate the modalities of cultural history. Put simply, we must put to rest questions of intellectual genealogy and turn our attention to what those ideas tell us about the broader culture, whether elite or common. What does the type of work Smith is performing tell us about antebellum hermeneutics? Other intellectual historian Quentin Skinner reminded us several decades ago not to mistakenly assume context to be the determinant for specific ideas, as what we are tracing is more the dialogic and porous culture than the ideological pedigree. This is an especially fertile and needed approach in LDS scholarship. For the next generation of Mormon studies, those who wish to explore Mormonism's developing theology must first understand the intellectual air in which its early adherents breathed, recognizing the eclectic theological climate of varying degrees of adaptation and agreement, and then attempt to determine the significance of Mormonism's mesh of theological answers. And once these answers are better understood, it is then crucial to apply these answers to larger cultural questions and issues, emphasizing how Mormonism both embodied and diverged from their larger biblical environment. In an important way, I conclude, this panel and the conference in general serves as a useful barometer in tracing the development in Mormon studies as a discipline, especially studies of Joseph Smith's thought. I think it's safe to say that if a panel on Joseph Smith and ancient texts were held at BYU a decade ago, the content would probably have been quite different. By moving past the limited and parochial questions of determining Joseph Smith's prophetic validity through appeals to his ignorance on the one hand of ancient sources, yet his triumph on the other hand of replicating these ancient truths, Mormon scholarship, especially scholarship on Joseph Smith, can move on to new questions of the type of work Joseph Smith was doing, not to mention the corpus of work he accomplished. Richard Bushman has recently stated that the aim of Mormon scholarship in past eras was to prove Mormonism true. Today, though, he notes that the aim is to find the truth of Mormonism. The implication being, as I understand it, that there is something about the rigorous study of Mormonism that claims power and potential to answer important historical, academic, cultural, and hermeneutic questions beyond the mere vindication of Joseph Smith's prophetic status. This, I think, is a worthy, challenging, and exciting goal, and I think this panel, in part, points us in the right direction. Thank you.